Hi everyone, welcome back to Sophisticakes. For this video, I'm going to show you how I made this modern ruffled fondant cake right after the intro. For this cake, I again started with some foam cake dummies that I had crumb coated in chocolate ganache, and I am covering with fondant. Now, the reason I keep doing these cake dummies is because we are eating way too much cake in this house lately. So this is a good way to give you the video on how to do it without having all that extra cake. So I rolled out, this is a two-tiered cake. I rolled out fondant to cover both of the cakes. And I added shortening to the ganache to get the fondant to adhere to it. Rub out all those air bubbles. And then I put a board underneath the top or on top of the top, and I flip it over so that I can have that fondant fall away from the cake and cut it off flush to the board instead of trying to cut it off when it's standing up right side up, because that can get kind of messy and you can kind of rip the fondant a little bit and it's not as clean. And I rolled this fondant out to about, it's about 1/8 of an inch thickness. And just cut up against that ganache as close as you can without actually moving the ganache onto the white. Because once it's on there, it's kind of hard to get off. You can get it off if you let it set up and get firm and dry. Then you can use some vodka or some Everclear to rub off the chocolate from the fondant. And I rolled out a panel. I'm going to panel this. I rolled out a panel, and I'm using my mat that has the markings on it, the self-healing mat, and make sure that you get the height and the circumference measured out right so that you can just roll it right on to the fondant. Now, you can do this with a real cake, but I wouldn't do it with anything larger than like a 6-inch because you could end up denting it quite a bit. There's a rolling pin method that you can use to do that on an actual cake that works a little better. But for a dummy cake, this works for our purposes. Now, I like to use a ruler pressed up against where the fondant starts and where you need it to end so that you can get a straight line and get the two pieces flush up against each other. Now, just rub that seam in as much as you can. This is going to basically be covered with fondant for the ruffles anyways, so you're not going to notice the joint. If you didn't have the fondant ruffles, you could just make that the back of your cake. Now, I'm using my fondant smoother to get all of those air bubbles out and a pin. Just pop the air bubble and rub it out with your fondant smoother. I set this into the fridge to firm up because that makes it a little easier to cut that excess piece off of the top. It's not flopping all over the place. It holds its shape and you can just cut it smooth. And then I went back in with an X-Acto knife to clean it up a little bit more. Now, when you do the paneling method like this, you're going to have a line where the two pieces of fondant meet. But that's okay. Nobody's going to see that. There are techniques to fill in that gap with some fondant that you soften up with water and kind of caulk it in there. But for this type of a technique, I didn't think it would be necessary. This is where I'm marking out my pieces that I'm going to use for the actual ruffles. I'm going to cut kind of an arch shape out of it. And for the pieces that you want to stick up taller than the cake, obviously you'd make the high point of the arch taller. So I had some varying sizes with these ruffles. And I'm just softening that edge. I didn't necessarily want to ruffle it with a ball tool. I just wanted it to be not a blunt cut. I wanted it a softer edge. And that helps you to get the ruffled look. I did this with all of my pieces, and I'm putting them on this foam. I like to do my thinning, my edge softening on a piece of foam. Now, this foam has only been used for cake purposes, but this is actually, I think this is foam that you would use like as a batting for furniture purposes, to add padding to furniture. And I covered up the pieces with a little bit of saran wrap just so they don't dry out too much. I didn't mind if it dried out a little bit so that it would hold its rigidity when it was up on the cake. But I didn't want it to dry out to the point where I couldn't wrap them around the cake. And this is going to be the tallest. You can see where that peak is a little taller. And I rounded out the edge, or I made it an arch so that you don't have straight corners on the edges of your fondant. You want it to be a gradual tapering down. Now, all this is just water, and I'm just brushing it onto the fondant with a pastry brush and let it sit for maybe 30 seconds to a minute so that it becomes tacky and your fondant will stick to it. You can also use simple syrup to do that. You could use shortening if you would like, but with the weight of the fondant pieces, these panels, I thought that the shortening, I was afraid it was going to peel off, so I didn't want to do that. Trying to fight gravity a little too much on that. And I'm just using my fondant smoother to try to soften those edges so you don't see so much the pieces of fondant where they end underneath the piece that goes on top of it. And pushing it down towards the board just to get the two to meet. And I'm wrapping another piece, a slightly larger piece, around the other side. This is a kind of an abstract design that I was going for. And so you can kind of see where the piece underneath of it ends a little bit, but you know what? I'm not going to focus on that or I'll drive myself crazy. And using that water just to get it to stick to the other piece of fondant. Smooth it out, get those bubbles out of there. And there was a bubble I was trying to push up. You can see it there. And I popped it with a needle from the side and I'm rubbing it out. And just arranging those ruffles the way that I would like them. I wanted them to kind of cup over just a little bit, but not, I wanted it to be not so neat. Just have some varying different waves within that ruffle. Now this technique actually is pretty quick. Pretty quick to do, big bang for your work on this one. I would say this is probably a more advanced technique. So if you have some experience with fondant, then you should be able to do this. I wouldn't start with this as your beginning cake. Work up to it. And you could do this in any color that you wanted. I just kind of like the idea of white. I'm a wedding girl. I like my wedding cake, so I'm a little bit more, as you can see looking back at my videos, I like the blush pinks, the gold, the white. I'm trying to get braver with color, so stay tuned. Maybe I'll get a little braver with color. Use your fingers. Your fingers are your best tool. Just make sure that your hands are clean and dry. Wear gloves if that makes you more comfortable, but especially with these dummy cakes, nobody's eating it. So it really doesn't matter so much. But just make a habit of washing your hands when you're working with cake because, you know, I don't need to tell you why. People eat these things. Not this one, but people do eat these things. Now this bottom tier, I didn't want as many ruffles. I wanted it to be more subtle or just not too gaudy. I wanted the top tier to have more of the focal or be more of the focal point. And I'm just running my fingers along that edge just to loosen it up from the fondant a little bit. That piece went on pretty smooth. I do have to say, there were not a lot of air bubbles in that one, but this was one of the first pieces that I cut out. So it had time to sit and firm up a little bit. So both of these pieces, and you kind of see it there, I didn't have to mess with it as much. It didn't need to be babysat. It already knew what form it was, what shape it was supposed to be in, and then it held its shape. There's something to be said for setting your fondant aside for a little bit before you add it to a cake, especially if you're doing like a ribbon edge around the bottom of a tier. Instead of cutting that fondant, that thinner piece of fondant, and trying to get it to go on the cake right away, it moves and it misshapes and it stretches. Let it sit for a little bit. Makes your life a lot easier. Work smarter, not harder, right? So for this cake, I wasn't sure if I wanted to add flowers or not. So I did show, at the end, I'll show you a version, a picture of with flowers and without. Then you can decide for yourself. I just love this. I love the what's the word? Continuity? The flow. I'll call it the flow of the ruffle around the tier. And to get them to stick, the top tier to stick to the bottom one, I just added a little bit of buttercream. And this one has been sitting for a few minutes, for a little while I did the bottom tier. So those ruffles have had time to firm up without actually being put in the refrigerator. Sometimes if you put it in the refrigerator and you take it out, the fondant has to go through a softened stage. It has to, the humidity difference between the refrigerator and the air brings out the moisture in the fondant. Even on a dummy cake, but more so on an actual cake. So you just need to let it sit and dry out for a while. So there you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did enjoy the video, please subscribe, like, comment, do all the things so that I know what you do and don't like, and so that you are notified of when I upload another video. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll catch you next time. Bye.